Welcome to this, our third conversation in our series on the future of open source, brought to you by the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy, a new research center whose mission is to foster research and analysis to ensure that new technologies are developed, implemented, and regulated in ways that are socially beneficial, equitable, and accountable. And by the Corporate Accountability Lab, an international human rights organization that uses design thinking and legal design to hold companies accountable for crimes against people and the environment. And by the Organization for Ethical Source, which believes that helping open source communities center equity and justice, meaningfully empowering technologists from traditionally underrepresented or undervalued groups, and focusing on real-world impact are key to unlocking the incredible potential of open source to drive lasting change and promote broad social good around the globe. My name is Michael Karanikas. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. On behalf of all three organizations, I'll begin by acknowledging UCLA's presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. We have a fantastic panel today who are going to be discussing the ethical stack, building on some of the previous conversations that we've had, and I'm enormously excited to introduce them all, so I'll jump right to it. Coraline Ehmke is an internationally recognized engineer and activist with almost 3 decades of industry experience. She is best known as the creator of the Contributor Covenant, the first and most popular code of conduct for open source communities, and is also the founder and executive director of the Organization for Ethical Source. Stephen LaPorte is a legal director for the Wikimedia Foundation, where he advises on open source governance and other legal topics. Stephen is co-creator of CollabMark, a trademark guide for free culture. He is also an active contributor to free software projects, including interactive visualizations of collaboration on Wikimedia, such as the Wikimedia Recent Changes Map and Listen to Wikimedia. Sarah Pearson is the General Counsel for Creative Commons, where she oversees the legal services necessary to support the globally distributed operations of Creative Commons and leads the stewardship of Creative Commons licenses and public domain tools. And our moderator, Nathan Schneider, is an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he leads the Media Enterprise Design Lab. His most recent book is Everything for Everyone, the radical tradition that is shaping the next economy. I'm very excited for this conversation. Nathan, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. This is really looking forward to this conversation. I'm Nathan Schneider at CU Boulder. I use he, him pronouns, and CU Boulder is on those unceded lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute. This conversation comes at a moment when free and open source software is at the same time in a moment of victory and triumph, as well as in crisis. On the one hand, this is a time where large companies are adopting free and open source software in kind of unprecedented ways, to the point where you can run Linux on a Windows desktop, and things sitting on GitHub as open source files are the infrastructure of the internet. At the same time, we're seeing a crisis of sustainability. This is a question of mutual ethics. How are people going to share resources and make sure that this important infrastructure can be sustained, as well as human rights questions? How is this technology being used for surveillance, for military purposes, for engaging in violence and suppression of human rights, oppression of people around the world? We also see abuses of some of the licensing regimes by large corporate cloud providers that call into question some of the fundamental kind of ethical and legal practices of free and open source software, provoking innovations in new kind of licensing regimes. So it's a moment where, on the one hand, this movement, this phenomenon of free and open source software is in crisis and is in need of reinvention at the very moment in which it's really at the height of its powers. So the speakers that we'll hear from today all have distinct perspectives on some of these issues, coming from some of the major organizations involved in this movement for many years. Because of the perspectives that they have, that they're coming at this stuff from, I've asked them to begin with a kind of small question. tell us, through the perspective of your experience, the kind of whole history and future of free and open source software. Where did you encounter this movement? What activated you as a participant? What about the early values of free and open source software meant something powerful to you? And what future do you envision for this now? How do you see this moment that we're in and where we need to go? So we'll take about 10 minutes to hear from each, 10 minutes each for the three speakers. I'll ask a few questions as they're going. Feel free to put questions in the chat. And after I ask a few follow-ups, we'll open the floor for discussion about these important issues. First, I want to turn to Sarah. Sarah, you ready to take it away?
I'm ready to take it away on that just small question that you started with, which I appreciate the way you framed it in such a personal way, because it kind of got me thinking about it in a slightly different way. So I want to start by just kind of a disclaimer and also just context that I'm coming to this from a non-technical perspective, both personally and at Creative Commons. We're dealing with open content, which of course, flowed from the free and open source software movement, but is different. We're extremely different domains. And I'm happy to be having this conversation because I think we should do more cross-pollinating and learning from each other. But I guess I just wanted to kind of lay that context because I think some of the things that I say might not resonate so much with software, but some might. So when I think back to how I was drawn to the open movement, I came as a young IP lawyer many moons ago, a journalism school graduate who was particularly interested in the future of journalism, and learned about Larry Lessig and Creative Commons, I think in law school, and then even more when I got to be a young corporate lawyer. And to me, I think what drew me to it is exactly what the founders got right, which is it shined a light on how these restrictive IP practices were so absurd in light of not just the way that creativity and knowledge actually develop, but also in light of the fact that we are living in this world of digital abundance where it just didn't sync with these restrictive IP practices. So Creative Commons licensing and open licensing felt almost intuitive or just natural to me. And I think they really struck a chord with, not just with me, but I think with the world. When I think about what they were blind to, I think I want to think about it from my own perspective. What was I blind to a decade ago? And I think there are a lot of things, but I will just mention three. One, I think the gravity of the business model question. I think that we glossed over that. I remember, I actually shudder to think about some of the things that probably came out of my mouth and pen, but I was pretty dismissive of the disruption of business models that was going to happen, and did not think about the fact that once that rug was pulled out from underneath us, we were going to be left with the reality that capitalism is not a good fit for the creation of public goods, which include things like the news and the arts. I think that I was overly dismissive of that. I think number two, I think we underestimated capitalism. We kind of assumed that there would be a level of reciprocity that there was no reason to assume was going to be there. And then the third one, and this is, I think, probably specific to open content, I think that a lot of us miscalculated what it really means to share with the world at large and how there are costs to that. And then related to that, how the costs of that are easiest to bear for those with the most privilege. And that means the most privilege in terms of having a way of financially sustaining what you do, and also just privilege in terms of not having to worry as much about personal safety and human dignity and things like that. When I think about kind of the journey of how I came to see those blind spots, it probably took me a lot longer than it should have, and it was a pretty zigzaggy, disjointed journey. There were a million books, but there were three books that I wanted to highlight today that ostensibly have nothing to do with this topic, but yet somehow crystallized bits of this for me along the way. One was Palaces for the People by Eric Kleinenberg. He talks about the importance of social infrastructure in the form of public libraries and public parks. And as I read that, all I could think about was, why didn't the digital social infrastructure that we thought we were creating with the internet, why does it feel like the exact opposite of that? Another was the book, The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. And there, what struck me was she talks about how to create meaning in your gatherings, and she talked about the importance of purpose, and she talked about the importance of what she calls generous exclusion, which is a notion I think we're probably all familiar with, but essentially means by keeping some people out, you are able to be actually more inclusive in the particular space. And this really runs counter to a lot of the things that we think about in the open world. And then the third book is actually Priya Parker's husband's book, Anand Giridharadas, Winners Take All, which has a ton of things in it. All of these are worth a read. But the thing that struck me was he talks about the importance of using the public sphere for things that affect the public interest, and how that necessarily is a messy process. It's a conflict-ridden process, and it has winners and losers. So the other thing I guess I wanted to talk about in terms of my own personal journey was a particular project that I started just over 3 years ago, a creative writing project with a friend and former colleague who may be on this call, I'm not sure, but we exchange letters to each other every week online, and we have a website where we do it, where I think this is our 170th week. And never once during those 3 years did I think about using a CC license in our project. And at first that was really kind of confusing for me. And you know, how can it be that we have this project where we have essentially created a commons, a generative commons between the two of us? It's a kind of public-private space, but yet it's utterly unfit for open, as I have come to understand what open means. So this gets us to the last part of your small question, which is what's the future of the open movement, or what do we hope for the future of the open movement? And to me, I hope for a broader, more nuanced definition of open that encompasses it in a non-binary way, that actually gets back to the original idea of open, which I think is this idea that no one can own our shared culture. And I think what we got wrong is we started thinking that the terms that we set for the shared culture were set by these particular licenses 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago, rather than thinking that, yes, that is one part of it. And I very much think that CC licenses are a part of the future that I want to see, but they are for things that are designed to be public goods. And there's a whole spectrum beyond that, where, you know, the terms that you set for your shared culture are much more fluid, they're more context specific. So I think they also better take into account things that we were overlooking, like sustainability and ethics. So I will stop there and look forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much. Wonderful start to this discussion. Coraline, are you ready to go?
Sure am. You know, my history with computers, and specifically with programming, goes back to when I was a little kid. And my dad, we were very fortunate to have a home computer in the late 70s. And back then there was no software distribution. There weren't even floppies yet. So the way that I learned how to program and the way that software was distributed was through magazines like Byte magazine or what have you. The back of the magazines, they would have source code listings, and you would literally type in a program and save it to cassette so that you could use it again. Fast forward to the 80s, and I think the 80s is really kind of the heart of where kind of an anti-establishment attitude really arose. And I think that was really critical to the development of FLOSS later. We had companies starting to distribute software on floppy disks that were copy protected. And there was something of an arms race between, I don't think we had the term hacker yet, maybe, but between people like me and these companies that were trying to commercialize software, which seemed like a pretty radical and dangerous kind of idea. So folks like me would specialize in working around the provisions that, or the code that companies were putting in place to stop piracy and stop copying. And it was, like I said, it was an arms race, but it was also a lot of fun. And then we get into the 90s, and with the discovery of the internet by a large part of the world, we had kind of solved the software distribution problem. But what we saw is those same forces at play in terms of corporations maintaining tight control over software. And I think the tradition that led to the open movement into FLOSS in particular was very much adversarial. It was very much us versus them. However, well, I'll start here. The premise of the open movement is that open is in itself an ethical stance, and in fact, the only relevant ethical stance. It was assumed that just by providing access to source code, that we would get equitable results in the world. But what we also did was try very hard to make the notion of open software palatable to corporations. And I think that was really a decision with a lot of consequences. So kind of at the philosophical level, though, one of the 4 principles that open source was based on is this idea of meritocracy. And some of us know that meritocracy was originally conceived as a satire and as a warning for what kind of future the world might head into. But FLOSS embraced it fully. And meritocracy, which basically says, first of all, your differences don't matter, which is a very privileged point of view. Meritocracy ignores disparities in who can participate. The Google open source survey that I helped develop while I was at GitHub showed that participation by women in open source is somewhere between 3 and 5%. We have no statistics on participation in open source by minorities because no one bothers measuring it. Another point that I think is an outgrowth of meritocracy is that we always were providing benefit and compensation to open source developers in the form of social currency. Sarah, you talked about things that you regret. Me, 12, 15 years ago, I was able to influence hiring practices at companies that I worked for. And I was one of those people, and I'm ashamed to admit this, that was like, we will only hire engineers who are active in open source. So it was literally a gatekeeping mechanism, participation in open source. And back then I didn't realize how inequitable participation really was. And this kind of led to my work with Contributor Covenant in 2014 with normalizing the idea of codes of conduct. That was a start. I think another kind of mistake that we made is we focused on adopters' rights to the detriment of creator rights, and also to the detriment of downstream people that are affected by technology, including open source technology. The rights that are extended by Freedom Zero only extend to other software developers or engineers or corporations, not the rights of people whose lives are interrupted or even taken away by things like extrajudicial killings by drone software. In 2019, the Defense Innovation Unit, part of the DoD, put out a glowing press release about how all of their drones were going to be running an open source operating system, and it was celebrated. And at the same time, we hear people talking about how tech is neutral. and we're celebrating empowering the DoD with murder, and we're like, yay go open source, right? I think the prioritization of corporate and government needs over the needs of maintainers and over the needs of what I call collateral users has led to some very bad consequences. But at the same time, we're told by the open source establishment that our work is neutral, that we are absolved of responsibility, and that open is an unqualified good. The adversarial approach that launched the FLOSS movement persists, and they rely on the goodwill of corporations to be sustained. And corporations are at best amoral, and the prioritization of their own revenue streams often makes them immoral. So the people that we've given all the power to, the adopters, don't have our best interests in mind, let alone the best interests of people all over the world. And I have opinions. I hope that kind of sketches out some of my thinking there. Thank you, Nathan, for the question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that emphasis on open as the only ethical stance, I think, is such an important starting point. Some of the power of the movement, as well as, deep danger. Finally, let's turn to Stephen. Stephen, tell us the history and the future.
Well, it's hard to be the third person to tell a story that has already been told so well by the people who spoke before me. But I liked the approach of answering this question from a really personal perspective. So as Nathan and others mentioned, I work for the Wikimedia Foundation. So I spend a lot of time in the world of Wikipedia. This is a project that, from an open perspective, incorporates two very different aspects of open. It's built on open source software. It is powered via open technology. It is run by a nonprofit. So it has sort of the freedom to make decisions that are more in the interest of users or interest of a public good than for-profit companies are able to operate with. It is also open content. So it's content that is gathered on Wikipedia, but it's also content that can be reused by others in textbooks and all sorts of other platforms. So sort of looking at Wikipedia as a place where openness is put into practice, I have a lot of fondness for the movement that we sort of collectively have been building around free and open source software and content. But you also get some really keen insights into where this movement is not working, the gaps that it confronts, the problems that our history has not really prepared us to address. As an advocate for free and open source software, someone who tries to make the case for using this in various circumstances, one of the things that strikes me is how we're talking about basically two different motivations for free and open source software that to the outside world are combined into one, but for anyone who spent any time talking to people who contribute are very, very different worlds, right? Like the open source community that surrounds Android is very different from the one that surrounds Debian. And if you know open source, you sort of see these distinctions very clearly. If you are looking at it from the outside, they're both something you're allowed to use without paying money, and that's sort of maybe the end of your analysis. But one of the things that I think open source has done well is combining these different types of communities together into something that is effective, because they are sort of united in a practical and ethical sort of motivation for adopting open source. That their combination, I think, has quite a lot of staying power. But as Coraline mentioned earlier, that these communities do not have a sort of a complete worldview. It sort of looks at very specific sets of rights and does not take opinions on rights beyond those, or when they do, they're not equipped to really answering the questions that are being presented. The two big blind spots that I see from open source conversations have to do with how people are involved in the conversation. I think that has to do with the input into open source, the people who create it, the fact that you need codes of conduct anytime you have a group of people trying to work together. The fact that you need more than just an agreement on open, you need an agreement on the purpose of what you're using. Show that open in and of itself is not the complete solution. You also have to think about the people who are affected by the output of, it's not just what goes into the open source software, it's what comes out of it as well. I think that the conversation around privacy from a legal perspective has really evolved a lot since the conversation around privacy when open source software licenses were written. I would have loved to have, maybe I would have loved, I don't know, I might regret saying that, but I would have loved to have applied some of the hacker ethos around the creation of open source software to something that could really preserve privacy in a as a common good and navigate some of the problems posed by personal data being incorporated into social media platforms and everything else. And privacy is not the only way people are affected by software. Just the use of software itself can have really deep ethical impacts. And we have human rights frameworks that there's been a lot of advocacy around social media platforms adopting, but we do not have the same depth of sort of human rights perspective in the development and application of open source. And you can't just assume that because software was developed in the open, it's automatically going to be used for good. On this question of a sort of personal experience that highlighted these gaps is sort of like a fresh lawyer, coming out of law school in San Francisco with a lot of software developers talking about open source. One of the questions I would get from sort of hacker friends was like, I like open source, so I want to make my software open, but what about the bad people in the universe? How can I stop them from using this software? Just name the company you don't like or the government that you're critical of. In having this conversation about how open source licenses are designed to function versus how just a single developer who wants something to be used by the public but doesn't want it to be used by a bad purpose made me realize like there's not a perfect answer to this question. It's something that I've been asked repeatedly, and I feel like open source communities have only started confronting in recent years really systematically. I think we have some tools to deal with this question, but I think there's a lot of conversation yet to have. So when I think ahead about the future of open source, we spent a lot of time proving it works. We spent a lot of time kind of testing it out in theory. I don't feel like that's the debate we're going to be having. I honestly feel like open source is in many ways here to stay, but we have to keep in mind that open source isn't a thing that you create and then it exists. It's a thing that requires people to constantly pour labor into, and it's a thing that exists because there are institutions that support it, both companies and nonprofit infrastructure. So I would really like to think about the people involved in those other pieces, the people who are putting their labor in and the people who are maintaining the output, and especially using some of the human rights frameworks that exist in the world. How can we import that thinking into open source and have a conversation that is maybe more mindful of the people involved going forward?
Fantastic. Thank you all for getting us started with your sweeping histories and prognostication. So I want to turn to the title of this session, this idea of an ethical stack. When you think about a stack, right, it's this kind of set of tools that are piled on top of each other and connected to each other that enables a system to work, drawn from the kind of technical metaphor, but we could look at it in another context too, right? So if we think about something like Wikipedia, it's got software tools, it's got an organization, it's got Creative Commons licenses. These are all pieces that make the system work. It's got a community. There are human levels, maybe. And so I want to turn to you all and ask, what do you want to put on the ethical stack. As Coraline said, there in some ways the open movement has been strategically minimalist, right? A kind of narrow overlapping consensus of openness as the kind of shared ethical framework. And we've pointed to a bunch of ways in which maybe that's inadequate. There's been a heavy reliance on licensing, for instance. I'd like to turn to each of you and ask, maybe for a much briefer response, just what is something you'd want to put on that stack so that we can start building a kind of a framework, a broader necessary framework of ethics around free culture and open source software. Would anybody like to begin, add their piece to the stack?
Well, first of all, Nathan, I want to give you full credit for coining the term ethical stack. That's an idea. It's a beautiful term, and we've certainly run with it. So the approach that OES is trying to take, and I've been pushing back against this, but we are not all about licensing as the only instrument for expressing and enforcing normative rules in open source. We take a broader view. So when I think of the ethical stack, I think about it as a system of accountability, responsibility, and harm reduction that begins within our open source creator communities and radiates outward. So a way of looking at freedom and rights that doesn't stop with adopters, but looks further down and looks inward. So the work I've done with codes of conduct over the past 8 years, that was like one of the first community tools that we started developing, and I learned the hard way that even with something as seemingly innocuous as a code of conduct, there's a big backlash against it. I have been doxxed multiple times. I've received death threats. I still receive a constant stream of abuse just for the idea that, hey, maybe we should have some norms for how we treat each other in creator communities. So I've learned that the status quo has an immune system. So I think we start with codes of conduct, and that sort of governs how we're interacting with each other in a creator community. And one of the main purposes of a code of conduct was to increase the safety and open the door to broader participation. So that's a start. The next step I see, and Nathan, you're doing amazing work in this regard, has to do with transparent and representative governance. And governance is really a tool for accountability, right? It's establishing what your responsibilities are as a community leader and as a community, and how they're being governed. I think this is something that we really can't afford to ignore anymore. I want to take the example of Chrome. Chrome is heralded as an open source success. And Chrome is obviously based on Chromium, which is an open source project, but it all feeds into Google's business model of exploitation, predation, and surveillance capitalism. Google rules the Chromium project, and they've done things like disabling or removing functionality related to accessibility. 2014 saw the removal of user style sheets, which was actually a violation of 2 different web standards around accessibility. What power do Chromium open source contributors have to say, no, that's not right? They have no power to say, no, that's not right. And there was like a quote from one of the maintainers that it's not, these decisions are not democratic. You can say what you want all you want, but we're not going to do it, won't fix. So governance that is actually meaningfully empowering to participants in the community. I see the next level of the stack being taking the social contracts that from the beginning have been implicit. Like you're going to give back to the community. You're going to not use licensing as a tool against creators. We're seeing violations of those implicit social contracts. So one of the projects that we're going to be developing in 2022 is an explicit social contract, an open social contract that defines inalienable rights, responsibilities as a member of a community, and the privileges you get as a result. Down below, we have licensing, which I would say is not a requirement. Ethical licensure is not a requirement for an ethical open source project, but licensing, we're building on the hack that was invented in the 90s, and really using every tool we can to promote equity within creator communities, a sense of responsibility for adopters, and a focus on real world impact.
Awesome. You gave us some really good stack layers there. Want to turn to our lawyers. What do you have for us? What can we pile on? Sarah or Stephen?
I have a few pieces that maybe overlap with some of the pieces that were mentioned before, but when I think about the pieces that work for creating a sustainable community, one of the foremost for me is the set of norms that exist. I think codes of conduct are one way to establish norms, but there are ways that communities set norms outside of specific rules through just social interactions that can really influence how a community grows. There's mechanisms that communities use to enforce those norms. So what I think of as dispute resolution mechanisms are extremely important, because your norms are really something that have to be put in practice somewhere. People need a way to raise a complaint or get their situation resolved. And if you don't have that kind of dispute resolution piece, the norms kind of feel like empty promises, or maybe are implemented in ways that are not useful for a community. And because we are talking about sort of like a digital space, I think a lot about the software environment that the norms and dispute resolution mechanisms exist within, because the actual user interface you have, the transparency that's built into the software, the ability to block people, these kinds of things can actually exacerbate or alleviate some of the problems that the dispute resolution mechanisms and the norms are designed to address. So Wikipedia, for example, has a number of tools that exist. It doesn't have certain tools that you find on social media software, like being able to block another user from contacting you. So we have a lot of conversations about, is this something Wikipedia needs to build in? That's completely separate from the norms and the dispute resolution mechanisms. That sort of triad of things, I think, exists below a sense of purpose that unites people. On Wikipedia, you're here to write an encyclopedia. It's not a place to share your opinion. That's not really a conduct question, but it is a question of purpose that has to unite all of the people who come into a community. And then below that, there's a broad question of how people join this community, how people are able to sustainably contribute. And that broad question, I think, includes questions of compensation. When you're dealing with open source communities, if you don't have a job that allows you to write code in your spare time, you're not able to even join in the first place. So there's, in my mind, a core of things that you need, but there's a lot you need above it and a lot you need below it in order for that stack to work.
I'm trying to think of what I can add here that would supplement, because you've covered so many things. And I think the point that I feel like is important to make is that there needs to be a framework that's context specific. And I think in some ways that feels counter to what we understand as open, because it's so, standardization is so central to how we think of open. But I feel that a key to kind of getting this right is actually thinking about these ethical and sustainability questions more from a context specific lens. And one thing I would point you all to, if you haven't gone into this realm, is the open education world has done some incredible work on thinking about all of these issues. And I don't know that they use the terminology ethical stack, but it feels very resonant. And there's a lot a lot of thinking about informed consent, for example, and thinking of the license as a starting point to conversations about how you want your works to be used, not as the outcome, that we're all not being so focused on getting the license applied, but actually thinking about the license, the process of licensing. So I think that's the point that I would add.
Excellent. We've got a bunch of stack layers, and then I think this is a really important intervention around maybe this idea of a kind of universal stack is itself part of the problem here. I want to invite people to start coming into the conversation from the audience. We're about halfway through the session, and a good way to do that might be to put a kind of one sentence version of your question in the chat, and I can turn to you and ask you if you'd like to flesh that out verbally, or you can just say in the chat, I can't use audio or something like that, and I'll read it for you. But as we wait to bring others to hear what others want to raise, I'm just curious a bit about that legal dimension, which has been so core to the open movement so far, right? The idea of licensing, the idea of relying on translating these licenses from software into free culture, into other kinds of domains. What are the kind of advantages and disadvantages of relying so much on the legal? And do you see the space of innovation as being legal in the future, or is it really other stuff that we need to focus on?
I would love to hear some of Sarah's thoughts on this as well. Maybe two quick observations from my side. One challenge that legal tools have is we work internationally very quickly online, where people live in very different legal environments, where they may have different rights, where they may lack certain protections or enjoy certain protections that others don't. So one of the things that I know Sarah has worked on is trying to figure out how to harmonize some of the different legal systems around copyright. And that's a hard task and relatively simple compared to privacy and some of the other legal regimes that people have. And I comment this mostly thinking about defamation, because that being a common concern with content on the internet. The second thing is that legal there's often a thin line between legal and social, where if you're able to get things right socially, you can avoid a legal conflict. And if you are able to set a legal tool like a license, you're also signaling a lot of social things, where a lot of the power of like a Creative Commons license comes from how it's used rather than how it's brought to court. But this is an area where I know Sarah has significant expertise.
So yeah, I'm just thinking about how to answer this question. I think that there is naturally an inclination for particularly lawyers to overvalue the power of the law. And I try to be a lawyer that is more cognizant of the fact that the law is actually, it's a floor, not a ceiling. It shouldn't be, it's legal, so it's okay. I think, and actually, I think that dynamic really plays out in licensing, standardized licensing in particular, because we are setting the terms and conditions for how these resources are to be used worldwide. And the bigger the scope is of where you're operating, the more people are going to treat it like a ceiling. Or is that the right metaphor? Anyway, treat it more like the tax code. Actually, that's what I think about when I think about versioning CC licenses. I think that we should think about it like the tax code, because we know that there are going to be constituencies that are looking for every little loophole, just like they do with the tax code in the US, at least. And that is just a reality that we have to operate under. And And I guess that is why I am reticent to try to solve too many problems with that tool, because I think that that's the kind of context that it sets up. And I think it's natural. And I don't know that there's much way around that. So I guess I see more possibility for innovation in these other layers and these other that can be more context specific by definition.
I think back to some of the theories of the commons that have been mapped onto the theory of digital commons, and maybe not always for good reasons or with a good outcome. But when Ostrom applied the filter of game theory to management of the commons, she laid out, some pretty important qualifications for how to make it equitable. And one of those was that you are disincentivized to cheat, to go against the common interest, if enforcement mechanisms are difficult to understand, difficult to use, and not trusted. It also relies on a low cost of enforcement. And I don't think we have any of that in the digital commons. I don't think we have any of that. We don't, a developer who starts a new open source project on GitHub has a number of licenses to pick from. And there are supplementary resources that say what the licenses mean. But what can you do as a maintainer if Google reimplements your source code or takes your source code and runs with it? You have no access to low cost, easy enforcement mechanisms. You have to get lawyers on your side and enter into a prolonged legal battle. So that enforcement mechanism is not equally distributed, and we don't trust it. One of the criticisms of ethical licensure has been, well, bad actors will ignore a license. Well, they're not just going to ignore an ethical license, they're going to ignore any license. So is that a justification for like not using licensing at all? Licenses are a tool, and I think licenses originally were used as a mechanism for incentivizing the behavior that we wanted to see by corporate actors, and really by incentivizing that, we've opened the way for exploitation and predation. We need to, but recognizing, like I said earlier, that corporations are fundamentally, at best, amoral. The only way that I think we're going to see any kind of change at the corporate or even governmental level really requires different instruments for holding adopters accountable. And that's what I see the role of the ethical stack being.
Thank you. Now we've got some really good questions starting to come in. I'm going to turn first to Ashley Williams, who's been raising some really good points in the chat. Ashley, do you want to give voice to your question about economics?
Sure. I actually asked yesterday, I was told yesterday was the license thing, so I wanted to talk today. We hear a lot about licenses when folks talk about open source, but potentially controversially, I kind of think the rise of open source had a lot to do with the economic affordances of it, like the incredible return on almost no investment that profit-seeking corporations get from open source. As we think about growing an ethical stack within the open source movement, I'm curious, like, how other folks see that economic structure and what challenges or opportunities that might present for this type of effort.
Panelists, feel free to step in, please.
I totally agree that an economic framing is helpful, and that's kind of what I was pointing to in terms of sustainability, giving back, and the violation of the implicit social norm that you will give back and support contributors. Very happy for orgs like Tidelift that are trying to redistribute some of the benefits granted to corporations back to creator communities. But why do we have to rely on a for-profit third party for something like that? And I think what we need to do is we've created economic incentives for corporations to adopt open source. We similarly need to create incentives for them to kind of obey the implicit rules that are that recognize the dynamic between a company like Google and a handful of developers doing open source in their free time.
Stephen and Sarah, would either of you like to respond to this one?
This is maybe a sub point. I think I broadly agree with what Coraline just said, and I think the economic framing is extremely useful. As a sub point to consider here, there's kind of like smaller economic negotiations that are going on within our industry as well. It's not just kind of like big corporations versus big communities. There's individuals involved who have employment agreements and have certain labor rights and certain bargaining powers with big companies. And I think one thing that it would behoove open source communities to think through is how they can maybe leverage the protections that do exist, which, frankly, in some countries are not a whole lot for people providing labor to companies. And open source can be one tool to empower people to take their intellectual creations from job to job. It's not just the skills they learn, but the technology they create. Now that's a negotiation, and I think that it's not one that employees are going to approach with even power with their employers. But I don't think we should assume that it is necessarily like a fruitless thing for people to investigate. So I think that there's a lot of economic considerations that we should consider for leverage as well as for understanding trends.
The economic question is different in open content, but yet still the financial sustainability of content creation is certainly, as I noted in the intro, I see that as one of our biggest blind spots at the outset. And I don't know that we have good answers for it yet, to be honest. One of the things I've done during my time at Creative Commons was co-write a book about business models that use CC licensing. And I think one of our kind of central takeaways is that people do it first and foremost, people use CC licensing or open licensing first and foremost for moral reasons because they believe in it, and then they figure out ways to make money. It's not, and those scrappy ways, there is no kind of magic solution. So when I think about, what's the kind of central kind of ethical dilemma for the future of open going forward, I think it really ties to this. What are the systems of knowledge and creativity production that can be sustainable and that people who contribute can have a good life while they do that? And it's tied up. I do not have answers because it's tied up in future of work questions. It's tied up in capitalism, but it feels like the central question to me.
Absolutely. And Hannah had, I think, an additional bit of precision to add to this question as well. Hannah, do you want to explain a bit about what you're thinking about?
Sorry, I had some issues unmuting. Yeah, I think this comes back to open source's sustainability and getting people involved. And there's a certain amount of privilege in being able to contribute without income or time or resources. And as a result, companies can feel like a necessary evil in order for open source to flourish and for people to participate. So is this the case? Is it a necessary evil, or is there a way going forward for companies to be involved and do so in a more ethical way?
Fantastic. Any panelists want to respond to that?
I think tying back to that adversarial stance that I mentioned as the one of the formative variables in open source, I think the reality is that we're never going to see an internet that is 100% open, and hopefully we'll never see an internet that is 100% closed. But we could talk about that, couldn't we? But rather, what we need to start recognizing as a reality and making our plans accordingly is that there will always be a relationship between closed or proprietary software, including internet software, and open software. And we need to look at ways to level the playing field there and kind of pull back some of that pro-corporate, pro-adoption success criteria and really start thinking about, like, how can we peacefully cooperate? How can we combine powers for broad social good? You know, it was kind of ironic that we saw Microsoft as the big bad in the 90s, and yet Google has adopted the same kind of embrace, extend, extinguish attitude. But we're like, yay, Chromium's open source though. Like, you know, we have to acknowledge that there are power dynamics and there are power disparities. And for as long as we do that, we're hopelessly naive.
We can, unless any other panelists want to jump in there, we can turn to another. Mitch, do you want to raise your question about the that old challenge of license proliferation?
Sure. Thank you, and thanks to all the panelists here. There's, for a long time in the sort of free and open source organizations, there's been concerns about license proliferation, which is to say that if there are too many different or incompatible licenses in use in the ecosystem, that raises problems about unpredictability, but about legally unpredictable interactions when software when projects are combined or used together. That in general, it creates a more challenging environment, and I'm wondering about the continued importance and viability of that norm. Does it apply when we're talking about ethical source? Is it, has it taken a back seat, or is there still some concerns along those lines?
I can try to jump in there.
Please.
I think that there is still a concern about license proliferation, and yet I think it's important for us to acknowledge and articulate the trade-off that comes with standardization. So standardized licensing, by definition, is prioritizing ease of reuse around the world in all these different contexts over the particular needs of particular communities. And that's a value judgment, and I think it is a good one in some contexts, particularly when you're talking about public goods that are designed to be used worldwide. But I think that there are plenty of situations that you can imagine where that isn't your number one priority. People being able to use it all over the world in connection with other content or code or whatever it is not the top priority. The top priority is dealing with adapting to the particular context that you're sharing in. So to me, it just comes down to a weighing of priorities. It's not necessarily that one is right or wrong.
I think, oh, go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think one of the risks that we have in open source movements is a desire to use copyright to solve problems that copyright should not be involved in. And I think if we sort of keep a check on that, we can also avoid some of the usability problems around license proliferation or the ambiguities of sticking ethical terms into open source licenses. I think there's a good deep conversation to have about when and where those things are appropriate choices to make. But I would also I keep returning back to this trend I sort of see in open communities where they get so into open that you end up in kind of a reverse copyright maximalist position. You're sort of thinking about licenses and then now using copyright to do other sorts of things that I just don't think copyright is the right tool for. And I don't think we should shy away from other legal tools and rights that need to exist to accomplish our goals. So I am concerned about license proliferation, but I don't think it's because the problem doesn't need to be solved. We're just maybe grabbing the wrong tools from time to time.
I think the pushback against license proliferation is in fact one of the symptoms of the status quo immune system that I was talking about before. Who benefits from a small number of well understood licenses? The people who primarily benefit for that is primarily for the comfort of corporate lawyers, right? It's about risk aversion, and we have institutions like the OSI that have risen up and consider it their duty to prevent new licenses from emerging. And all of that is based on the assumption that what was true in 1998 is true in 2021. The approach that OES took with Hippocratic license, we are, one of the things we're violating, and one of the norms we're violating, is acknowledging that it's tricky and it has limitations and it's complex and it is nuanced. So why don't we do what software engineers always do and iterate? But iteration is disincentivized. Iteration is actually actively fought. Licenses also rely on a centralized authority like the OSI. The open source definition has changed very, very little since 1998. And I think it's very telling that the open source definition, first of all, is 100% licensing centric, and traditionalists insist that licensing is the only criteria for what defines open source. And yet the open source definition is not itself open source.
That's a mic drop if I ever heard one. Fran Cabrera has made a few comments in the chat. I wonder if you want to give voice to those.
Oh yes, I have low vision impairment. I am really worried because the Marrakesh Treaty become into force, and the editorial and the open source and the public libraries, they deny the application because of the lack of resources and because there is not really, like you said, an open source code for people with disabilities. So I wonder if maybe Creative Commons can make derivative work for people with disabilities, because the content is really different because of the body and diversity of the mind and the issues that we have to face every day. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much. And this points to something that Coraline raised in passing that I think is really important, which is around accessibility. Would anyone like to respond to this?
I'm trying not to talk too much.
Don't worry about that.
The ethical source principles, which we developed collaboratively earlier this year, one of the 7 provisions is that accessibility is a human right. So we absolutely believe in accessibility, but our definition of accessibility extends beyond. And I want to stress accessibility for folks with who live with disabilities or other conditions is absolutely paramount. But there's another form of accessibility that's outside of that domain, and that is the gatekeeping mechanism of technical fluency as a gatekeeping mechanism. An example that I came across very recently, I was doing some research and I ended up on Wiktionary. And there was a page I was looking at, and it had a table of data, and it said on the page, like, you can't sort this data, but if you go and copy this JavaScript from this site over here and add it to your toolbar, then that'll give you the ability to sort the table on this supposedly digital commons site. And the little piece of JavaScript that they pointed to was just some guy's blog, just some guy's blog. So that required a certain degree of technical fluency to fully take advantage of open content. And I think that's absolutely an accessibility issue as well. And that ties into, like, who are we extending rights to?
Stephen or Sarah? Okay, we have a comment here next from Pero about the relationship between the concepts, as I understand, of freedom and the ethical. Could you unpack the question a little bit? I'd love to hear more about what you're thinking. Okay. Well, Peros says he prefer not to talk. Writes, as far as I know, the term freedom opened a debate in the beginning of FOSS movements. Some people just don't like the term. Don't you think that the term ethics and ethical license share that kind of repulsion? Most developers don't think or agree that their practice implies ethics. I think this raises really interesting questions about the kind of core terminology that we're using. I'm curious what you all think about the kind of status of freedom, which is so important, particularly in the free software movement, and what relationship the language of ethics has to that earlier discourse.
This, to me, sort of goes back to the layer of the stack that I think about at the very top, like the purpose that we have around a lot of our work. I think the word ethical can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but that doesn't mean that ethics do not exist, or that it's even impossible for a group to come to a really good understanding, a shared understanding of what kind of ethical outcome they would support and what kind of decision they would make in a certain circumstance. So I think part of one of the things that these ambiguous terms do is they force community conversations around a sense of purpose, and that conversation is extremely valuable. In fact, I actually worry about situations where people don't have these conversations. Some of the simple click here to copy and paste a license agreement that avoids this kind of like deeper conversation, it can cause a lot of community harms and fractures, or situations where communities lose a sense of purpose. So it might not be a bug, but I think you're onto something by pointing out that these debates will likely happen. Something
that I talk about in kind of the talk I gave in Belgium last year that in a lot of ways crystallized this is it goes back to mid-20th century when World War I was over, when people saw the horrifying experience of death as a result of being exposed to poison gas. The chemical industry came together, and there were international conventions on ways to eliminate or at least reduce the use of chemical warfare. World War II, we saw the atomic bomb being dropped on 2 Japanese cities. And we saw atomic scientists and physicists come together to try to address the moral issues, the ethical issues that being a nuclear superpower brought with it. And they founded projects like the Doomsday Clock. In the 50s, when people were beginning to see the tremendous leverage that computer technology would bring, they also tried to raise these ethical concerns. Edmund Berkeley, the founder of the Association for Computing Machinery, in the 1950s sat on a commission called the Committee for the Responsibility of Computer People. There wasn't a name yet. And one of the findings that they had, they said, first of all, you can't ignore your social responsibility. And in fact, as a technologist, you have a greater than average burden of responsibility because of the way technology is deployed at scale. And one of the things that really stands out in my mind that the commission said is there are certain classes of work that are obviously social good and certain classes of work which are obviously socially harmful. And we can acknowledge that there's a large gray area in between, but that doesn't mean we just throw up our hands because it's too hard of a problem to solve. And I think what we see in the pushback against a lot of the work that OES is doing is like this notion that it's so gray that we can't possibly figure it out. And that's really disappointing because I thought as engineers, we'd love solving hard problems. But apparently if we can't solve from first principles and we have to collaborate in a multidisciplinary way, that's seen as a failure. And I think that's terrifying.
Yeah, I guess I would just, echo in slightly different words what Coraline and Stephen said, that the conflict between the definition of freedom and the conflict about what ethics mean is completely foundational. And it seems to me that we are kind of at a turning point for the open movement. I don't want to be too dramatic, but I feel like these conversations are foundational, and we're at to me, I think it's an inflection point. It'll be interesting to see what happens. And I'm really energized. I attended all of the workshops this week, and it's really nice to see so many kind of familiar faces from the open world in these conversations, because I think a year or two ago that might not have happened. And so to me, it feels like progress, like Stephen said, that we're just even having these conversations is really important.
Great. And you start to see ways in which the ethical stack might connect, the pieces need to fit together, right? For instance, if you introduce that concept of ethics, then you have a bigger conversation about what ethics means. It's might be a little easier to define open, and that worked well, for instance, in a context where avoiding complex and thorny governance was part of the goal. But as Coraline suggested, if governance is part of the stack and there's a recognition of a need for groups to be able to make decisions and to come to conclusions about what their commitments are, then ethics becomes something that you can start incorporating. And you can't really incorporate ethics, I think, if you don't have space for that kind of deliberation. Jeff has a point here about the relationship with regulatory bodies, which I think is really interesting. We've talked about law and reliance on law. I think Jeff's question goes a little more toward enforcement around human rights. Jeff, do you want to break down your question a bit? If you're not able, I can read it and can't unmute. Okay. What's the panelists' thoughts on how ethical licenses appear as an individual response to regulatory failure and the inability for legislators to protect individuals over corporations? Is this a kind of patching a bug in our democracy, or maybe even just putting a Band-Aid on it? Curious about your thoughts about the relationship between whether these kinds of ethical issues maybe should be addressed somewhere else in the context of government, as opposed to by communities of peer producers themselves.
I absolutely think that they should be addressed in public spaces, and we should be seeking regulation. And I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. We have seen how long it takes to get any kind of meaningful regulation in so many different domains, that I think it is entirely understandable to look for other ways to patch in the meantime. I mean, I think the ultimate outcome should, of course, be legislation, but sometimes you don't want to wait around. And I think I'm uncertain about how I feel about, to Stephen's point earlier, about using copyright for non-copyright purposes. I think I have similar hesitations, and yet I've been doing some reading of Amanda Lewandowski's work. She's a law professor at Georgetown, and she makes a really compelling argument for using the tools that we have. And one thing that's happened is copyright has become this extremely powerful tool because of corporate interests. And is there a way that we can leverage that? I mean, we were initially leveraging it to grant permissions to do things, but you could imagine, and not only imagine, but it has happened in certain contexts. For example, the one that she's written about extensively is non-consensual pornography. People have effectively used copyright as a lever, and it is different than how we initially imagined using copyright, but it is in some ways feels justifiable to me. So.
I think on this question, it sort of goes back to my thinking earlier about the international collaboration that happens online and through a lot of technology these days. I think that there are vast differences in the rights that people enjoy and their ability to sort of get protections from their governments. And in democratic spaces, there may be ways to actually use governments to exert power that's necessary in order to instill, more ethics into our technology. Like, I think with problems of like surveillance-based, the surveillance-based industry that powers a lot of like revenue, you're really not going to make change, I think, without a lot of like regulatory power that governments can bring. And I think similarly with like antitrust questions, these are going to require probably international efforts. But on the flip side, there's also going to be a lot of users who do not have the benefits of a democratic space, are dealing with very, very real safety concerns, and governments that are trying to use that power against their own citizens. And navigating this is going to be really challenging. But I think that, as Sarah says, we don't have to use one tool or the other. We can sort of, iterate and explore and find the right solution. But it's going to be challenging.
And I want to address something I keep seeing in chat, and I keep seeing in other places, about saying that it's too fuzzy. The instruments, for example, that OES is developing in collaboration with Corporate Accountability Lab for the Hippocratic license is tied to internationally recognized standards for human rights. So I think pinning yourself to a mutually agreed upon ethical framework is super important. In terms of copyright, I think it's really interesting that copyright was used as a tool in the original FLOSS licenses. And when folks are continuing to try and use it as a tool, it was used as a tool to promote the ethical stance of open. And now we're seeing people say, oh, but not that ethics, or no, not in that way. And it's like, it's a tool at our disposal. It's going to require a lot of tools. It's going to require the ethical stack to affect real change. Yeah, I think we should stop using straw man arguments and start like really focusing on actually solving the problem and using every single tool at our disposal, because that's what hackers do, right?
Right. So we have another question from Samuel. Do you want to give voice to that?
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for the conversation so far. It's been fantastic. Kind of going off of Coraline's point about the idea of ethical standards and this idea of ambiguity, why do you think that there is such an acceptance to the idea that when we're talking about copyright being used to curve ethical behavior that we're so willing to say that it's ambiguous, even when there are standards that clearly spell it out. When there's other commercial agreements that dictate behavior themselves, such as NDAs, non-competes, non-solicitation agreements, why do we not engage in that same thought exercise with those types of agreements and kind of tend to do that when we talk about ethics?
I mean, to some extent, I think it's because it's a pretext for actually seeing it as contrary to what open means to people. That is my speculation. Because I do think I don't think that it is true that it is not possible to define ethical behavior in legal instruments. We do it, as you said, we do it all the time. It's difficult, and its clarity is extremely hard in those instances. And I think we have to be really careful about that, but it's not impossible. So I think it does get tossed around probably as an excuse sometimes.
And Sarah, I wanted to touch on one of the things that you talked about earlier about like how nuanced it is and how context matters. A lot of the work that we're doing next year, we're putting together a working group to reimagine contributor covenant, for example. What I mentioned before about the iterative and collaborative approach that we're taking with ethical licensure. A lot of the guiding philosophy for the work that we do is about the distribution of agency. So we need to agree on some fundamental standards, a fundamental understanding of rights, responsibilities, and privileges. But one of our philosophies is to make as few decisions as possible and distribute agency, especially with a mind toward equity, especially toward a mind toward meaningfully empowering people from undervalued, underrepresented communities who frankly bear the brunt of the impact from the insistence that technology is neutral. So I don't think that we should have a centralized authority on what is ethical and what is not ethical. And we're certainly not positioning OES in that respect, but rather giving agency to creator communities to, first of all, come together and define what their ethical frameworks are, define what their shared values are, and then give them a way to enforce them. And the modularity of Hippocratic license actually plays into that. It allows, the modular nature will allow creator communities to specify which areas of justice and equity are most contextually appropriate to their communities, whether it's ecocide, whether it's environmental justice, whether it's labor rights. All of these available as modules really is about empowering creator communities and trying to level the playing field between corporate and government adoption and creator communities, and then the impact on the broader world.
Good, thank you. I just want to get a couple more questions in. There's one here for Sarah from Pero, who had trouble unmuting before, so I'll just read. Are there attempts to intersect copyright law with labor law? An approach that we've been discussing in our communities is that because software is a product of labor, licenses could involve labor contracts. Great question. Also connects, for instance, to one of the ethical source licenses, the 966.ICU license, comes out of China around worker rights. But Sarah, do you want to take the lead in responding to this since it was addressed to you?
Sure. So yeah, the short answer is I have not heard of anything in the Creative Commons realm tying copyright to labor law, but I would toss to Coraline because I think that you all have been doing some innovation in that realm, right?
Yeah, I'm very excited about about the kind of convergence that we're seeing. I'm very thankful, and Sarah, I have to give you a lot of credit for this. The fact that that different organizations in the digital commons space are starting to recognize that there are shared problems that we face, and that collaboration and multidisciplinary collaboration is absolutely essential. I know, Nathan, you're doing a lot of work in terms of co-ops and I've seen a lot of worker organization. We're seeing a pushback against NDAs. We're seeing pushback against corporate ethics washing. I think all of these efforts are related. They're all in response to the injustices that we're seeing at scale employed by technology. And I would love to see more collaboration across these different dimensions so that we're all not narrowly focused on one single aspect of justice and equity, but rather see it as part of a broader movement. And I think that's what open really needs to put itself in the center of.
Stephen, do you have any thoughts to add on there?
No, I like the I like the line of thinking, and I think that there's both ways to think about it individually as well as a community. And these things like labor is a big part of how open source is created. So this is something that I think is in even communities like practical best interest to really explore and understand how labor rights can benefit their work.
Great. Actually, one example I point to along these lines, one of the things that kind of got me excited about some of the possibilities of ethical licensing is from Dmitry Kleiner's Telecommunist Manifesto, kind of classic little pamphlet, and where he proposes this idea of a license that would allow sharing among worker-owned organizations where workers were benefiting exclusively, but not among others. And it's also been kind of formulated as the peer production license, kind of an experimental example, but one that was very interested in putting labor at the center of licensing. Just to wrap us up, I'd love to invite a quick round of kind of short answers to Ashley's most recent question here. Ashley got us started, and so maybe it's appropriate that Ashley finishes us off. The question is, do we think open source as it exists today is here to stay? Can it be, when contribution can be enabled without ownership, do you think that we'll see the end of contributor control? Have we seen that? So, as Grace Lee Boggs often asked, the kind of activist grandmother for many social movement leaders in the U.S., what time is it on the clock of the world right now in the context of the conversation we've been having? Let's just wrap up with that. Would anyone like to start, of our panelists?
I can go. I feel encouraged by the fact that we are now having these conversations and openly addressing possible harms of open. I've been, like I said, I've been at Creative Commons for 10 years, and I feel like there have been many years where there's almost a fear of acknowledging some of these things as if it's all so brittle that if we just point out that there are complexities, that it's all going to fall down. And I think we weren't really giving it enough credit. And I'm really heartened to see that these conversations are now happening openly. They're happening here, they're happening within Creative Commons in our recent organizational strategy. The types of things that would have seemed impossible a few years ago are now being openly talked about. And I think that that's an encouraging sign for the future of open, because I think the more we just got trapped in the fear and talking points, the more we were less likely to kind of fade out into irrelevance.
I think, yes, open source is here to stay. I think at what level, at what vibrancy, and to what end is a really big open question for me. And I think our conversations here are, I'm glad they're happening, but I think that there's been a lot of larger conversations about the role of technology in society, and it has largely focused on maybe a few big tech platforms and big scandals around those tech platforms. But I think that the open source space is going to need to reckon with a lot of these things one way or the other. And it probably behooves us, if we want to see it continue to be, robust and vibrant and sustainable, to figure out these questions before it's before it sort of like becomes a shell of basically what it aimed to be.
I agree, and I think that some of the things we have to overcome. I've hit on this a lot of times. No longer ignoring and no longer pretending that technology is neutral when we're seeing open source deployed at big scale. We've talked about collaboration between different institutions in the open space. But I see a lot of us, I see a lot of the problem is that insisting that the problems we had in 1998 are exactly the problems that we have today, and that exactly what worked in 1998 continues to be relevant, central, and unmodifiable. And I have to say, I was pretty disheartened with the new executive director of the OSI dismissing these conversations, as he literally said, we're seeing the zombies of closed source and open source rising from the graves that we put them in the 90s. So I think as participants in the open movement, we need to insist on governance that it's actually realistic and reflective of the challenges and needs that we have going forward with the success of open source.
Thank you all so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Just invite everybody for a moment before I turn it over to Michael to close this out. If everybody who's able could, on the count of 3, unmute and offer some oral, starting with an A, applause for our speakers. I think they've earned it. It's been a really rich discussion. 3, 2, 1.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Gracias.
Thanks to all of you. That was fantastic. We're just about at time. So I want to give my thanks to our fantastic panelists and our wonderful moderator for a really interesting conversation on this issue. A very quick time to plug a couple of events that we have next week if folks are interested. On Wednesday, we've got the next installment of our Ethics and Tech series, which will feature Dunstan, Alice, and Hope of Business for Social Responsibility. On Friday next week, we've got another event on regulating data surveillance with speakers from Berkeley and Princeton and the Internet Watch Foundation and Citizen Lab, which is going to be really interesting. And our big event is in the first week of November, featuring David Kay and Jorn Marby, the head of ICANN, and Wendy Seltzer, and a lot of fantastic Sarah Roberts, Mark Lemley, a lot of brilliant speakers in the tech policy space on power and accountability in tech. So I just posted a link into the chat for folks that want to check out any of those future events. Thanks again to Organization for Ethical Source and Corporate Accountability Lab, both of which were fantastic collaborators in this, and thanks to all of you who are attending. Please continue to watch the space as we're looking forward to future engagement on this very important issue. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great weekend.